Welcome to Rick Gone Life, brought to you by the Liberty Media Project. I'm Rick Amitin, and this is where we love to talk about the things that impact our lives. And today we're going to be talking about the world of working moms with Suzanne Brown. Suzanne is a strategic marketing and business consultant, a TEDx speaker, and author of Mom Empowerment, and insights from successful professional part-time working moms who balance career and family. Her book is due out in mid-September, and she lives in Austin, Texas with her husband and 2 young boys. Suzanne, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, Rick.
Well, first off, congratulations on the book. I know what it takes to decide to write the book and then what it takes to actually produce a book. So I'm well aware of all the hard work and the edits and re-edits and and the rewriting of so many things. So anybody who actually accomplishes the full task of bringing a book to print has my admiration. And so congratulations on the book. And I think it's a very worthy book, and we're going to talk more about that in a minute. But tell us a little bit about Suzanne. Just give us your little bit of your personal story.
So I am, one of the things that I don't always talk about, but it is definitely important, is I'm a big time international traveler. So I had a goal of hitting 40 countries by 40, and I actually reached that goal.
Congratulations.
Thank you. And I've kind of built my career on being, on doing things my way. So my undergrad degree was in finance, and I worked in the ad business. So, it was all about making things the way I wanted to make them. It was about lining up my career the way that I wanted to line it up. And I have to say, having kids kind of turned that on its ear.
Sure.
I had a pretty good idea of how it was all going to look. And then our older son came along, and it's like, wow, this is not exactly how I had pictured it in my head, but it's, I love being a mom. So, and I love being able to be the mom that I want to be and still be a professional. So it kind of led me to write a book.
Great. I have very little admiration for people who try to make complaining a career. And it seems to be in our culture that many people have sent out their applications for the job of constantly talking about what the problems are and offering us very little, if any, solutions. And so I think that what you have done in your book addresses a very worthy cause, but it doesn't just paint the picture of the difficulties or the challenges, but you also address strategically some solutions to really help working moms out who want a career and to be a mom at the same time. But what moved you? You mentioned it briefly in your opening remarks, but what moved you to write this book?
So I was having coffee about 4 years ago. So at the time, our older son was about 2. I was having coffee with a fellow mom who also worked part-time at that time. And we were talking about the fact that we get asked all the time about how do you make it work part-time? How do you find, how do you find jobs? What are you doing? How do you bring it all together? And so I said, there's got to be a resource that we can just send these people to, because we got questions on a pretty regular basis. And so I said, I'll find a resource, I'll email it to you, and we can just send people there. And then I went and I looked for this resource, and there isn't one. And so I said, I'll just create one, in my free time when I'm not
which you have plenty of
everything that I'm working on. And I don't think I really knew what I was getting myself into. I didn't necessarily think that I was writing a book initially. I wasn't sure exactly what it was going to look like, but I said, I'm going to start asking other moms how they make it work, because I didn't want anybody to click on to the website or read the book or what, whatever it was, because again, I didn't really know what it was going to look like, and say, well, yeah, if I worked for myself as a consultant in marketing in Austin, Texas, I could do this too. It's like, no. There's all kinds of women who are doing this. And so it took a really long time to find all of those women. It took about 3 years to do all the interviews. But there's just a need. And as a marketer, it's all about positioning your product, or it's about filling the need that's out there in the marketplace. And so I said, this is not a small thing. It's not a small group of women who want this. Literally almost half of moms want to work part-time. So I'm going to create a resource that they can use. And then I decided to write a book somewhere in there.
Well, you mentioned that you have interviewed, I think 110 women?
I think technically it's 112, but yes, over 110.
Okay, so, but in that process, what are the demographics? Were they all mothers working part-time? What was the makeup of your 112 interviews?
So everyone worked part-time. And they were in all kinds of different industries. So I had women who worked in financial services, in marketing, in engineering, doctors, lawyers. But these were women who are seasoned professionals. About 62% work for another company, like whether it's big or small, but they work for somebody else. And then 38% roughly work for themselves.
Were they all mothers?
All mothers.
All
so
mothers.
You had to be a mom in order to actually be interviewed.
Right.
There were not even a handful who had not worked. So they were stay-at-home moms, and then they went part-time. Almost everybody had worked, and then they scaled back. The average number of years of experience was about 9.5-ish. And they had been working part-time for like 6.5 years. So, we're talking about women with average of about 15 years of experience.
What were the common issues that rose to the top that you knew where everybody was struggling with the same thing?
So there were a few kind of challenges that once I did the analysis, because everybody calls things different things.
Right.
And so once I did the analysis, they kind of fell into a few different categories. So one of them was kind of more professionally related. So things like women might have been overqualified for their job, or something that was interesting that I saw was that women didn't necessarily continue to increase their skills. So it was almost like their growth in their skill set was kind of frozen. There was the other issue, which is a financial issue of, if I worked more, then I might be able to then I would make more money. Although I will caveat that by saying that of the group that I interviewed, the average salary was around like $45,000, and they only worked 20 to 25 hours a week. So, and $45K from the research that I did is about the national average for working 40 plus hours.
So do you, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, and so even though, there is a financial question of like, yeah, if I worked more, I could make more, they're still making the national average working only half the time, so there is that question of what are the expectations? And then honestly, some of the other issues that came up were things like, how do you fit all of the stuff that you're trying to fit into less than 40 hours? It is a constant challenge, and it can require creativity in how you look at your productivity, how you ask for help, how you talk to your significant other, so that it's not just you against the world, but it's you have that person who's helping you out, who lives in your household. So yeah, there were a lot of interesting things that moms were struggling with, but I think those were kind of the biggest groupings.
Do you think that the skill sets became frozen? I mean, I can assume, the obvious, that they were preoccupied with children and activities and family, and if that's true, or was it a conscious choice that they just stopped, expanding their skill set, or were they frustrated because they couldn't continue to expand their
I think it was
skills?
the last one, because I talked to some really, honestly, very ambitious and high achieving go-getters, and I think it was more a frustration with, they wanted to be able to continue to grow their skills, but they just simply didn't have the time. And so they needed to accomplish this whole list of things for their job. And so how do you increase what that skill set looks like if you're trying to just achieve in this period of time, in less time, maybe even the equal number of tasks? Because that is one of the things that some women did. They simply cut back the number of hours, but they didn't actually cut back their workload.
Yeah, I think, I think it's always kind of a mistake, to try to fit everybody into a particular paradigm or stereotype them, or, I doubt seriously that all of these women have the exact same goals. I think some of them, and you correct me, you tell me here, you're the expert, but I would think that some women were very happy to get their skill set and income to a certain level so that they could maintain that and do the additional things that they wanted to do with raising children and family, while some other women were probably very frustrated because they wanted to do more. They had an appetite or a capacity for doing even more. Is that true? Or
You're right. I actually kind of grouped them into three categories. One was still very much the high achievers. They were still rocking and rolling in their careers, even though they had scaled back on time. And to be quite honest, a lot of those women didn't actually have a pay cut, even though they cut back on their time.
wow,
Yeah.
that makes some
and
of them very happy.
Sorry?
That would make some very happy.
Well, but if you think about it, in the US in general, when we look at employees, we look at people based on hours, right? And we don't look at people based on productivity. So, even in my case, I remember when I was, and this was before I was married or had kids, and I was hired to do a job, and I was an MBA recruiter, so I was in HR, and I literally didn't have enough work. And I was honestly bored out of my mind. Like, I could not deal with it. And so I went to my manager and I said, you have to give me more to do. Like, this is literally not enough to fill my day. Like, there's no way I can fill 40 hours a week with this. But you do your job to fill out the time, right? But we don't actually measure people based on productivity unless we're doing like bonuses or maybe if you're going to move somebody up, you're going to give them a promotion. Like, maybe that's when you start looking at something beyond like literally hours in a seat. And so if you understand the value that you bring to the table, why should you get a pay cut if you're even more efficient and more productive with your time? It actually
Sure.
makes sense when you kind of think through it you kind of have to turn your perspective though, because it's not how we normally think. And so having those conversations really made me think through a very different side of being an employee, because normally what happens is if you have somebody who's really productive and they go to their manager over and over again, and they're like, I just don't have enough work. I mean, how many times does a manager say, oh, well, you know what? Why don't you just go home? Like, That's
Yeah.
fine. Just go home. No, they're going to
Good many.
they're going to take the work from Mary down the road or down the hall who's not getting all of her work done, and they're going to give it to you. So basically you get penalized for being efficient and you get handed more work. So I hadn't really thought about it that way, but it totally made sense as I was hearing this conversation kind of over and over with some of these women. So they had very different conversations with their manager or senior leadership, or they started, they became consultants. They went and they worked for themselves, or they went and worked for a small consulting company. And literally, they worked half the time and still made the same salary, like a six-figure salary.
Yeah, a number of years ago, this working from home seemed to catch, fire, and it became very trending. And there was more employers who were open to not only women, but even men working from home and believing that they could be even more productive, less time traveling on the road, back and forth, all of that sort of thing. But then recently I read an article where many companies are shutting that down, that the work at home programs, they're phasing them out because they didn't produce everything that they thought that they might or hoped that they might. But I'd like to go to your TEDx talk, and where you mentioned 6 major shifts that we're facing in our country. Tell us about your perspective on that.
So in my TED Talk, I talked about some specific ones. So we'll talk about this in a little bit more detail. So one of them is population shifts. And I don't think that people necessarily think through population shifts and what are they really doing and how do they open up opportunity. And so when I say population shifts, I mean things like baby boomers. Every day, 10,000 baby boomers turn retirement age. Literally every day. And that will continue for at least the next decade. And so if this happened, it's not going to happen, but if every one of those baby boomers retired as soon as they turned retirement age, like bam, I turned retirement age, I'm out the door. I mean, we're going to have just a bleed of intellectual, what's the word that I used? Just the whole, like, intellectual memory, everything that a company knows, it's very much in people's minds. It's in their experience. It's not like in some computer. And so all of that is going to walk out the door if all of those baby boomers walked out the door. Now, they're not going to all leave, because the reality is that most baby boomers are not actually ready for retirement. But if they did, I mean, just think about that, right? And people have said to me, oh, well, artificial intelligence is going to take over all of those jobs. And one, it's going to take a while for AI to actually kick in. And two, they've done studies that show that it's not really whole jobs that are going to turn over to AI. It's really going to be parts of jobs. And the jobs that are going to be completely removed are probably going to be more like physical labor, like moving pallets or things like that. And that you don't necessarily need people to do that over the long haul. But how, so we basically need people to stay in the workforce right now, right? Like, we can't really afford for more moms to leave the workforce. And we actually need even more stay-at-home moms to come back into the workforce. So that's one thing. Another thing to think about is women are actually having their first child later in life, okay? Which a lot of people think, okay, well, what's the big deal about that? Well, the kind of bigger deal is what percentage of those women aren't coming back to work? Because it's mainly your educated women that are having their first child later in life. And they don't necessarily need to come back to work. So those women who are more inclined to take on leadership roles and who can be major money makers for their family, not necessarily the breadwinner, but they can certainly bring in a lot of income. Well, they're not. What happens if they don't come back to the workforce? Or on the flip side, if they're having babies later, what happens if they don't have as many babies? You know, and people have said to me, well, who cares? We can have immigration, and we won't get political, but immigration is not necessarily a positive thing right now. And so we might not be having as much immigration in this country. And if we want our economy to grow, we literally need population to grow. Like that is a simple part of economic growth. It's literally continuing to have the same number of bodies or more, even better, having more. And women are actually not having as many babies. I mean, just outright. And so, you know, so those are some of the population shifts. And they actually bring great opportunity. You know, you could have a baby boomer and a stay-at-home mom who want to come, those two want to both work part-time, and you could have them work together. You know, they could literally share the same job, and there would be the opportunity for baby boomers to pass on their knowledge to a stay-at-home mom who's decided to come back to the workforce. You know, that's an easy way to transition knowledge. So that's,
Mentoring, what a novel idea.
you know, and the thing is, here's the thing that I realized as I was kind of looking through all this research. Nothing that I found is groundbreaking. Like, it's not like I created a brand new thing, but no one is actually looking at all of these things together. You know, so I took a holistic approach. So the people who study things like baby boomers aren't necessarily looking at the millennial generation. They only study baby boomers. That's their area of expertise. That's all that they do. The people who are looking at the effect on on a company aren't necessarily looking at the economic impact of not having as many people, right? So you have people who stick to their sliver of knowledge, and they're not thinking about, it's almost like the formula of this plus this plus this plus this. Like, there's just more at play, but people aren't necessarily looking at the whole pie. They're just taking their sliver out, and then that's all that they're focusing on.
Yeah, I think that behind most of all of our issues is a lack of understanding. And I think that's what expands, you know, our ability to solve our problems and drive solutions. It's to understand the larger picture. And I do think what we're facing in our country as a whole, from social stuff to corporate environments, you know, it's all being driven because of what you reflect, and that is people becoming so focused on only what their slice of the pie is, and they don't realize how connected it is to the pie. And so, you know, when we want to really start solving problems, we're going to have to, you know, to give up our candy sticks and join everybody at the table, you know, and talk, you know, like adults should talk. And so, you know, I think you bring up a ton of, you know, valuable insights that we should be connecting, and rather than just, you know, trying to use these formulas that solve one problem and create 10 others.
So true.
But let's, you also talk about mindset, and I think maybe it was a blog of yours that I read, or you talked about mindset and shifting, you know, in our thought processes. Speak to us about your perception there.
So, you know, people have asked, okay, well, if you want to transition to work part-time, you just have to scale back. And it's not exactly it. I mean, there is a whole mindset shift that you have to go through, because you do have to accomplish a lot in a shorter amount of time, right? So, and you have to kind of keep all of the things in balance. And some of those mindset shifts are things like thinking about your value versus thinking about your time. Part of it is based on, you know, how do you reach out for help? Because even part-time working moms need help, you know, and it could even be like your kids folding and putting away their laundry, but that is a mindset shift, and you can't be a superhero all the time with everything. Some of it might be that you have to rethink, you know, what do you want to accomplish in the time that you work part-time, as far as like the number of years? Like, are you going to continue to grow? Are you going to coast? So that could be a mindset shift. Are there things that you need to think about even before you make the transition? Like, are there seeds you need to sprinkle? Are there ways that you need to interact with other people so that you're more intentional with your time, being intentional with your time,
Yeah.
looking at work-life balance differently. And so it's actually a huge mindset shift that you have to go through when you decide that you want to work part-time. And I think working moms just kind of need to be ready for it, because it's hard to just flip a switch and be like, okay, today I'm going to work part-time. Yesterday I worked 55 hours and think that it's going to be this easy shift, right? Like it will take time, and it might actually be better to work, 50 hours and then scale back to 45 and then go back to 30, go down to 38. And then let's say 32 is where you want to net out, so that transition happens over like 6 months instead of just tomorrow I'm going to work part-time, But I also think that concept of value and like, what do you bring to the table, and how do you talk about that to your managers, or how do you talk about that to your clients? Because even though you might have, over a decade of experience, but when you become a solopreneur, you've got to basically be able to talk to that from day one. You've got to be able to talk about, like, what do you bring to the table? Yeah, you're a new entrepreneur, but you're also a seasoned professional with a decade of experience.
Yeah, I think, yes, absolutely. And I can definitely see that. I think the most powerful word that you use there is intentional. And I think when we are intentional, we tend to think about things differently than being reactionary or, just being responsive to something that we either like or don't like. But I think when you're intentional, you actually want to develop a strategy to work through all of the challenges that you will face to make, these kinds of changes. And so we become more aware, more conscious, of what our goals are. And I love your perspective just from the beginning, which is I wanted my life. I wanted to do it my way. And, and I think that resonates with me, because I did spend a lot of time of my life not operating from that perspective. I was trying to accomplish the things I wanted through paradigms that were never going to get me there. And at some point, for me, I had to back up and say, no, that's not the life I want. This is the life that I want. And I become intentional about doing that. And there were challenges to that too, from a man perspective. So I definitely understand the challenges of, that you're addressing. And I don't perceive to understand fully, what a woman is experiencing with her career and motherhood and, balancing all those responsibilities, because a man under normal circumstances doesn't have to juggle that same, that same basket of balls there. So this is enlightening for me.
I will tell you this though, I've had many people say, well, you're being sexist. You're saying it's all about moms. And I originally was going to try to do a book that was for both. Like once I finally realized that I was going to write a book, I said, okay, well, I can interview some dads and I can interview some moms. And it's really about working part-time as a parent. And what I found though is dads actually have a slightly different, it's a nuanced difference, but they definitely go through something different than moms do. And so I don't think the next book will be the dad version, but maybe in 2 books, I'm going to have a dad version, because I do actually think that those dads who want to work part-time do actually have challenges that are different than what than what part-time working moms want to accomplish. And so I don't want to discount that. But the reason why I started with the mom side is, that's my lens. Like every day when I look in the mirror, that is the lens that I have, right? Like
Sure.
and everything I've ever read has always said, start with what you know. Start with what you can relate to before you go try to discover what other people can relate to. And so for me, like, I can understand being a part-time working mom, right? But a lot of what I talk about can be applied to, to dads. But I recognize that there's a little bit more going on there that that I couldn't just slap, it's not like I could just go through their book and just say, anytime I say mom, replace with dad, and
Yeah.
slap a new title on the book. Like there is a little bit more to it.
Yeah, I could see commonality there, but I could also see distinction. And so from my perspective, you probably did exactly the right thing, and that is address one at a time.
Right.
But if you do move on, I'll be very interested, from your perspective on the father side. Although I've gone through all of that, it's mostly behind me now. But I do remember that my wife and I made a very conscious decision when we were raising our children that she was going to stay home with the kids. It was on purpose, intentional. There were sacrifices involved in that. I mean, we didn't have the benefit of a second income. We made those decisions when we had the least amount of money. And so when our last child, we have raised two, and when our last child went to school full time, it was my wife's idea to start working part time. I wasn't even a fan of that. I didn't want her to go to work for purely selfish reasons, but not all bad selfish reasons. There were some, I wanted to think that it was working the way we were doing it, and that I would continue to, increase our income, and that she wouldn't, from a necessity standpoint, I didn't want to feel like it was necessary for her to do that. But, I was also a very young man, and so I had to listen to her address her own ambitions and feelings of wanting to do more than just be at home. And so when she made her argument, I saw her point, and she started working, part-time, and it worked very well. And I did see that her life was enriched and made a little fuller. And we didn't really lose anything, at home. I had to become a little more, I think, helpful, around the house, and that was good too. That didn't hurt anything. I didn't lose my masculinity because I, learned to do some other things. And so, over time, as her own career advanced, I realized what that did for her in the long haul. And I was so glad that we both made the decision for her to stay home initially, and then for her to, pursue her working life, later on. I couldn't be happier with both of that. But sometimes I think there's the political argument that still gets made, and I don't put a lot of stock into the political argument because it's usually a very small argument that's getting an awful lot of media attention, and it's not really the true argument. But there are, because I think the real argument probably happens among mothers, sitting in on the playground bench talking to other mothers about the challenges they face, with working part-time, contributing monetarily to the household, and the family not suffering, or the children, not suffering as a result of some time that they spend doing other things besides raising children. I think that's probably where the real conversations are taking place. But in your interviewing and in the writing of your book, did you still, or did you discover that there is still the argument where in some circles, stay-at-home mothers, if they chose not to work, are still being demonized?
My research didn't necessarily cover that topic
Okay.
as far as my interviews go. But the thing that I think is so hard is that it's really kind of opposite ends of the spectrum, right? You either have stay-at-home working moms or you have full-time working moms. And so there is very much still that tension, right? It's like, well, I made the right decision to stay home with my kids. And full-time working moms say, well, you know, I want to work, or maybe it's that they need to work. And so you kind of have both. There is a lot of friction there, and that has not gone away, which honestly is unfortunate because someone that I interviewed actually made a really interesting point, which was some moms are perfectly happy being stay-at-home moms, and then there are other moms who really feel that drive to work. And it's not necessarily because they need the financial impact, right? They don't necessarily need the money, but they need to work, like from an intellectual stimulation perspective, or even from a personal identity perspective. You know, I am a much better mom when I'm working, and I know I'm not the only mom who I talked to who felt that same way. And so I think that those women who are able to stay at home are, you know, I don't necessarily feel that people are saying bad things about them. In fact, I think that there are more people who think that moms should stay at home. And I don't remember what the percentage is. There's actually been research done in the US that I want to say it's around like 60% of people think that moms should stay at home with their children. But I will tell you that on the flip side, there has been research done that actually shows that the daughters of women who work, and that can be part-time or full-time, are actually more likely to have a job in the future, more likely to have a higher paying role, a higher paying salary, and more likely to be a supervisor than the daughters of women who stay at home. And in that same study, they looked at the boys of these working moms, and they found that those men, as they became dads themselves, so obviously years later, were more likely to spend more time with their children. You know, so it's almost that there's more support for staying at home, even though the opposite has been found true for their own kids.
Yeah, I revert back to my point I made earlier, and that's about understanding. You know, we can make these arguments from either an intellectual standpoint or an emotional standpoint. But when we bring them together with understanding, you know, it makes us take a step back and really evaluate, you know, what's really happening. So let's just hope we all continue to gain some understanding here about, you know, how these things work. I know one of your goals is to expand this conversation. You know, I know that you would like more employers to start entertaining and creating work situations for women, mothers who want to work part-time. I think you've done that. But in a larger scale, you know, what's your big hope for the book here?
So the book is really, it is designed for moms to be able to figure out how to be successful with this transition, right? So it's all about, it's kind of like a one-stop shop so that a mom can pick that up and they can see mindset shifts. What are some of the conversations I have to have? What do I need to have in a proposal that I hand to my manager that I want to work part-time, or really for that matter, that you want to transition to any other kind of flexible work arrangement? What are some of the my own habits that I might need to change? You know, like, so it's a one-stop shop from that perspective. Ultimately, what I really want to be able to do is a lot more speaking, and I want to be able to transition that to having more of those conversations with employers, because we really do need we need more work-life balance. Like, that's something, that is something that we across the board need. with especially with the generation that's coming up. And so I want to be able to start having those conversations and doing more of the consulting on the side of, essentially HR initiatives. Now I'll put the stake in the ground officially that the next book that I am working on will be from the employer perspective. So that's why I said the next book will not be the dad version.
Yeah.
But, I looked at it as when I was looking at all the different ways that I could take these stories that I was getting and what do I do with them, being able to write a book and having that as, one of the things in my toolbox kind of set me up better to do the public speaking and to do the consulting over the long term. And so the book is an element of the long-term strategy. And I don't know if authors always think about it that way of, how will this next step get me to the long-term goal? And so I'm a strategic marketing consultant. I have to think about it that way.
Yeah, and I think that's great. And I do think it's important because I had some of those very same thoughts when I wrote my own book. It was really about, okay, I'm writing this, but how do I really get this message out? What do I really want to do? And so that was one aspect of it. But the other aspect, and I'm sure it's the same for you, but when people are reading your book, when these working mothers are reading your book, what is your hope for them? What do you want them to be able to take away from your book?
I want them to be empowered to think differently about their career. And then they actually will have like a how-to. So it's kind of a 1-2 punch. Because if I didn't create it with more stuff in it, so more about this mindset, more about changing these habits, and how do you take this information from your career and reapply it to other places. If I didn't have a more kind of, again, holistic approach to things, it's like, okay, great. You've told me all that. That's nice. But how do I actually apply it? And I didn't want that to be the purpose of, it's almost like you can DIY how to make it happen. It's like, okay, I feel like I can make this change. Now I'm going to go make this change, instead of, well, let me give you some of the tools and then you're going to have to buy the second book in order to do that. It's like, that's not really the purpose. It's like, make it happen. I'm a make it happen kind of girl. So I want other moms to have make it happen kind of moments.
Yeah, you started a Facebook community for working moms to connect. Give us that address.
It is www.facebook.com/groups/MOMPOWERMENT.
Great. And all of your links, of course, is going to be produced in an article that will accompany the show. So when the show airs, there's an article that will have all of your detailed links where people can connect with you. But I want them to have an easy access to you today. So what is the preferred or best way for people to connect with you?
So if you want to kind of see because I write a weekly blog, so if you want to see a lot of the things that I write about, some of them are in the book, some of them aren't in the book. Some of them might be mentioned, and I kind of talk about them a little bit more on the website. The website is www.mompowerment.com. And then I also, I do a lot of tweeting. I'm a big Twitter fan. And so you can follow me. I'm at MOMPOWERMENT on Twitter, because I share a lot of stuff on Twitter that isn't necessarily mine. It might be articles that I find really helpful, or new resources, because it's not like my book is not the end all be all. There is a ton that's out there. Mine just kind of combines a lot of things into one place so that you don't have to go find them elsewhere. But there are some great resources that are out there. And so I make it a point to be able to share those things so that moms can see, oh, well, if I'm looking for this is a great author that talks about this one piece, or this is a resource where I can find these kinds of jobs. And so I try to continue to combine all of that information. So again, you only have to go to my Twitter feed, but you can, from that you can branch off to a lot of different places. Or in the Facebook group, we talk about a lot of different things, But, again, we still talk about like tips that you can apply tomorrow, or resources that you might find where someone said, I listened to this podcast and it was so helpful in meal planning, or, whatever it is. But that way we're continuing to share the resources so that moms can get more and more information, instead of like, okay, great, I know I need to fix that, but where do I go?
Yeah. Well, Suzanne, you're absolutely delightful and refreshing, and I wish you more success than you ever dreamed. And I hope that lots of people, especially the working moms, I hope they see this program and connect with you and find some answers to and some solutions to the challenges, that they face. But thank you so much for being with us today. And again, I wish you much success in all that you're doing. Anything else that you'd want to mention before we wrap up here?
I so enjoyed chatting today, so I just wanted to say thank you for having
You're
me.
welcome.
And I love what you're doing with kind of spreading the word, with making people think through things a little bit differently, and sharing some of the elements that authors are dealing with too. And so, I'm just happy to be part of that discussion. So thank you for having me.
Sure, you're welcome, and thank you again so much for being with us. I'm Rick Amitin here at Rick on Life. Thank you so much for joining us today. And remember, whatever is going on in your life, just sprinkle a little love on it. See you next time.